Hello, my friends. Welcome back to English Unleashed. Today, you will listen to a brand new story in two parts. This is part one. The story is called The Lighthouse Keeper's Promise. A lighthouse is a tall tower built near the sea. It has a bright light at the top. The light helps ships find their way at night, especially when the weather is dangerous. This story is about an old lighthouse keeper named Tobias and a promise he made many years ago. At first, Tobias only cares about doing his job perfectly. But slowly, he learns that love and courage are more important than perfection. Let us begin. On a small rocky island, far from the mainland, there stood a tall white lighthouse. The lighthouse had stood there for over 100 years. Its light turned slowly every night, sending a bright beam across the dark water. A beam is a straight line of light that travels a long distance. Sailors who saw the light knew they were safe from the sharp rocks hidden beneath the waves. The keeper of this lighthouse was an old man named Tobias. He had lived on the island alone for almost 30 years. Every evening, just before the sun went down, Tobias climbed the narrow stairs to the top of the tower. He cleaned the glass, checked the oil, and lit the great lamp. He did this task every single night without missing a single one. Tobias was proud of this. He often said that a lighthouse keeper's only duty was to keep the light burning, no matter what happened. Tobias was not an unkind man, but he was very strict with himself and with others. Fishermen who sailed near the island sometimes waved to him, but Tobias rarely waved back. He believed that talking and laughing were a waste of time. His whole life belonged to the light. He trusted nothing else. Many years before, when Tobias was a young man, he had made a promise to his father, who had been a lighthouse keeper before him. His father had told him, "Tobias, my son, the sea is a powerful thing. It gives us fish and carries our ships, but it can also take everything away in one storm. Promise me that you will always keep the light burning. Promise me that no ship will ever crash on these rocks because our light went dark." Tobias had promised, and from that day he had never broken his word. One autumn evening, dark clouds began to gather over the sea. The wind grew stronger, and the waves rose higher and higher. Tobias climbed the tower early that day because he could feel that a storm was coming. He had seen many storms in his life, but something about this one felt different. The sky turned a strange greenish gray, and the air became very heavy. By nightfall, the storm had become terrible. Rain fell like thousands of tiny stones against the tower windows. Thunder crashed above the island, and lightning lit up the sky again and again. The waves crashed against the rocks with a sound like cannons firing. Tobias stood at the top of the lighthouse, watching the light turn steadily through the storm. He was not afraid. He had seen worse nights than this. Then, through the noise of the wind and rain, Tobias heard something else. It was a faint cry, coming from somewhere near the shore. A faint sound is one that is soft and difficult to hear. At first, Tobias thought it was only the wind playing tricks on his ears. But then he heard it again, a child's voice, calling for help. Tobias's heart began to beat quickly. He grabbed his old coat and a lantern, a small light that a person can carry by hand, and hurried down the tower stairs. He ran outside into the storm, his coat immediately soaked with rain. The wind pushed against him so hard that he could barely stand. But he kept moving toward the sound of the voice. Near the rocks by the shore, Tobias found a small fishing boat, broken and turned over by the waves. Holding onto a piece of the wooden boat was a young boy, no older than 10 years old. The boy's lips were blue from the cold, and he was shaking with fear. Beside him, unconscious in the shallow water, lay a man, the boy's father. Tobias did not hesitate. He pulled the boy out of the freezing water first, wrapping him in his own coat. Then, using all his strength, he dragged the unconscious man onto the dry rocks. The man was breathing, but only barely. Tobias knew he had to act quickly, or both the boy and his father would die from the cold. But then Tobias remembered something terrible. The light. He had left the tower, and no one was there to keep the great lamp burning. Without the light, any ship still out on the water that night might crash upon the very rocks where he now stood. Tobias faced an impossible choice. If he carried the boy and his father back up the long path to his small house to warm them by the fire, the lighthouse would remain dark for many long minutes, perhaps longer. But if he ran back to the tower first, the boy and his father might not survive the freezing wind. For a moment, Tobias stood frozen between the two paths, rain streaming down his face. He thought of his father's words. No ship will ever crash on these rocks because our light went dark. He had never broken that promise in 30 years. But then he looked down at the boy, whose small hands were gripping his sleeve, whose eyes were full of fear and trust, and Tobias understood something he had never understood before. A promise to protect people from danger could not mean turning away from people who were already in danger, right in front of him. Tobias made his decision. He lifted the boy onto his back, and with great effort, pulled the boy's father up as well, half carrying, half dragging him across the rocks. Step by step, fighting against the wind, Tobias carried them both to his small stone house near the base of the lighthouse. He built up the fire, wrapped them in every blanket he owned, and made sure they were breathing steadily before he allowed himself to think of anything else. Only then did Tobias run back out into the storm and climb the tower stairs as fast as his old legs could carry him. His hands were shaking, partly from cold and partly from fear, as he reached the top. The lamp had gone out. The tower had been dark for nearly 20 minutes. Tobias's heart sank. 20 minutes was a long time on a night like this. He quickly relit the lamp, and the great beam of light swept out once again across the dark, furious sea. He stood there, breathing hard, searching the water with his eyes, terrified of what he might see. The broken pieces of a ship that had crashed while his light was dark. But he saw nothing. No wreckage, no signs of disaster. Only the wild waves, glowing faintly under the returning light. Tobias did not know, in that moment, whether any ship had truly been out there during those 20 minutes. He would never know for certain. But he knew, without any doubt, that if he had chosen differently, the boy and his father would certainly have died that night on the rocks below his tower. The storm raged on until early morning. When the sun finally rose, the sea grew calm again, as it always did after a storm. Tobias went down to check on his guests. The boy, whose name was Samuel, was sitting by the fire, warm and safe. His father, a fisherman named Edric, was awake now too, weak but alive. Edric looked at Tobias with tears in his eyes and thanked him again and again for saving his son and himself. Tobias only nodded quietly. He was not a man who used many words, but something inside him had changed. For the first time in 30 years, he did not feel alone. Music. That is the end of part 1, my friends. Tobias has made his choice, and his heart has already begun to change. But will he ever see Samuel again after this storm? And what will Tobias do with the rest of his life on the lonely island? Join us in part 2 to find out.